The second temptation then that lurks around the edges is the temptation to secure agreement by nailing down definitions. Oh man, I don't know like where this is going. I really like to nail down my definitions. Now, Kellenberg says, now Peterson doesn't actually attempt this. She writes that by human nature, natural law theorists roughly mean the perfect definition of a human being. But from what soil might such a definition grow? Lost to us forever is the Edenic pre-fall state of perfection with freedom, able to sin is the case here. And prior to grace, human nature is corrupt, damaged in every fiber, although human nature is not as bad as it can be, theologically speaking. Augustine explains that before we meet Christ, nothing we do might do or be in the state is without sin, not able not to sin. And I think we talked about this a little bit before in some of our last books, although I can't quite pin down which one we've talked about before. But in future critique of this, this is going to be brought up again.
Yeah. So what he's doing here is he's even though he says he's not going to criticize her, he is somewhat criticizing her. So he's giving us 4 ways to understand, what we mean by human being, right? And then he's going to and then he's going to go from there. So the first way, as you mentioned, is this pre-Adamic, pre-fall state where Adam and Eve were able to sin, but they didn't have sin, right? And then there's the state where before we meet Christ, we're not able not to sin. So there's a different kind of human nature state, right? So the pre-fall, able to sin, but don't have sin. The after the fall, not able not to sin. The third one, he says, after we meet Christ, grace abounds for the Christian. We then have freedom, but not perfection. And so we no longer must necessarily sin. And so the idea here is that we're able not to sin, right? So we are able to sin, but we don't, Adam and Eve. After the fall, we're not able not to sin. We sin, right? We have to necessarily. Mm-hmm. Once we meet Christ, we're able not to sin. And then finally, he says, according to Augustine, in the state of the redeemed human nature will remain until our resurrection, after which our nature is perfected. And then we are at the state where we're not able to sin. And so that's the fourth kind of way to look at human nature. And so he says, from which of these 4 states then is the perfect definition of a human being to be drawn?
Right.
And Peterson, he says, appears sensitive to the fact that our attempts to read human nature off of actual human persons is distorted by the fact that the human specimens under observation are imperfect and, distorted by sin. So when I take our moral bearings from Christ instead of a punitive, perfect definition. So notice what he's done here. He says, she's kind of just reached out there and say, based on the nature of who we are, mm-hmm. And he's suggesting she hasn't really clarified that. There's bunches of ways to consider our nature, but she's kind of reached out there and said that's the basis of ethics. And he says, well, wait a minute, why not just instead of just using only our nature, whatever that might be out of these 4, why don't we just use Christ, right? He says God did not send us a definition, right? In terms of human nature, he sent his son. We have not been given a definition. We've been given a savior who is also our example. And so here you see now his virtue ethics coming through. How do we know what the morally right thing to do is? Well, it's not based only on our human nature. It's based on who Christ is and his character and his example. Right? That's what he's getting at here.
Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about it, the one that makes the most sense, and I believe I'm correct in attributing this, is when we read Scott Christensen's What About Evil, especially when talking about the pre-Edenic state, the pre-fall of what is it that we're trying to do and there seems to be almost a special case with Adam and Eve there. But after the fall, that's where we really become simpatico with them. But at the cross, looking towards the cross for people before the cross, and then us looking back to the cross, well, now we have a perfect person and a perfect God to look at, to conform our lives to. So I think he makes a stellar point here of it's not so much in the nature, because, yeah, it's going to be hard to then define exactly what we mean. Okay, to live sinlessly. Well, can we do that? Is that our telos, is to live sinlessly? Well, in one sense we can, but in what sense is that? Well, there it's by accepting Christ as Savior and living in such a way that is pleasing to Him, conforming our lives ever so much to His heart, so that our heart becomes His. But at which point do we say, okay, I've completed it. I've run the race and now I'm perfected. Well, it seems to be almost outside of our nature for that. And so, in what sense then is nature to take on the definition of purpose, right? So, is it a single one true for everybody, or is your personal endpoint different for every single person? So I think this is a good point for him to make, especially coming from his perspective.